decision of his reign, and for that alone, we shouldn't kick him around too much. When we come back, we'll begin the reign of Trajan, who, as I said, is widely considered one of the best emperors in Roman history. A military man at heart, he would leave Augustus's injunction against further expansion in the dust and push the empire into heretofore unconquered territory, bringing back with him riches that would fund a century of Roman brilliance. As a result of his campaigns, practically every standard map of the Roman Empire you see today is labeled down in the corner, Roman Empire at its greatest extent, 117 AD, or something like that. That was Trajan. He was Rome at its greatest extent. However, I must tell you that Trajan will have to wait until after the new year. I'm taking 2 weeks off for the holidays, but we'll be back on January 10 to begin the century Gibbon famously called the period when the condition of the human race was at its happiest and most prosperous. Happy Saturnalia. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you are now aware, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going there, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There's no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book that you got. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription packages and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend Rome at War, Farms, Families, and Death in the Middle Republic, a new addition to the library that I have not yet read, but is on my list of new books to pick up. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 79, The Dacian Wars. When Nerva died in January of 98 AD, news of his death generated as much relief as it did sadness. We know from last time that Nerva was no egomaniacal, despotic monster whose death was eagerly anticipated by friend and foe alike, but neither was he seen as the best man for a very difficult job. The best man, everyone agreed, was Trajan, and from the minute he had been adopted, the death watch began on Nerva. The sooner the old emperor died, the sooner imperial authority would be back in the hands of a man who would know how to use it properly. So when Nerva slipped his mortal coil, just months after naming Trajan heir, everyone agreed how nice it was that the old man had not dragged things out. Rome would again be ruled by a proper emperor, not a political fixer in over his head. The crazy thing about Trajan is that in his almost 20 years in office, he actually managed to exceed the high expectations everyone had for him. And after his death, every subsequent emperor would ascend to the throne blessed by the ceremonial prayer, "May he be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan." There was no drama surrounding the succession, as he had already been entrusted with most of the important powers that collectively made up official imperial authority. In the few months between his adoption and Nerva's death, the two men resembled colleagues far more than they resembled present ruler and future heir. As I mentioned last time, there is even some speculation that Nerva was planning to abdicate the throne as soon as Trajan was settled into his new position, but died before he had the chance to. Some wanted Trajan to take over completely right away, but the general declined to even return to Rome during the brief time he and Nerva shared power. Perhaps it was just that he was too busy monitoring the situation on the Rhine, but it could also be that he understood all too well that he would utterly overshadow Nerva should he return to the capital, and out of professional courtesy, he stayed away. I would believe either explanation, but his well-documented political humility and respect for the pride of proud men makes the latter an enticing conclusion. But then again, he would be emperor in his own right for more than a year before he finally did make his way to Rome, So it could be that he really was just too busy ensuring the security of the northern border to come back to the capital for some speeches and religious ceremonies. Careful attention to the real responsibilities of office, as opposed to the lavish trappings of power, was another of Trajan's character traits that endear him to everyone, ancient, medieval, and modern alike. Like I said, Trajan spent most of his first year in office traveling the empire's frontier, first along the Rhine and then the Danube. Mostly satisfied with the defensive fortifications Domitian had put in place, Trajan eventually arrived in Moesia, the province opposite the kingdom of Dacia, where he paused, studied, and concluded that war north of the Danube was inevitable. As a career military man, he was well aware of the theory among his peers that the peace treaty Domitian had signed with Decebalus, and now the new emperor was witnessing firsthand the fruits of that poison tree. The money and material Domitian had sent to Decebalus was supposed to be used to bolster the Dacian border facing away from Rome, to help the new client king fulfill his responsibility as a buffer against the uncivilized tribes beyond the frontier. But Trajan's scouts reported back to him that Decebalus had actually built a substantial fortification network facing south, towards the Roman provinces. The implication of this fortification network was all too clear. Decebalus was clearly anticipating future hostilities with Rome. The only question was when the next war would break out. But Trajan was a patient man. While he immediately apprehended that he was, at some point, going to invade Dacia, he knew that he couldn't just go flying off half-cocked. While the situation in Dacia was going to come to a head eventually, it did not look ready to explode just yet. Undertaking an invasion on the scale he envisioned was going to take careful planning, but most of all, it was going to take a solidified political position at home. He was popular now, the new car smell still lingering in the air, but Trajan understood how quickly novelty can wear off. Without the support of the people and the Senate back home, it was pure folly to go off conquering abroad. So, bidding an until next time to the Dacian kingdom, he made his way back to Rome in 99 AD. His arrival in the capital was as magnificent as any triumphal procession. His return to Rome had been anticipated since Nerva had named him heir, and the whole population of the city turned out to cheer their new emperor. Setting the tone for his reign, Trajan did not ride in on a splendid chariot or atop a great steed. Instead, he entered the city on foot and walked down the streets, greeting his adoring subjects. He continued in this vein as he met with the Senate, adopting a deferential tone and vowing to continue Nerva's policy that left men of senatorial rank free from the fear of imperial persecution. The Senate had been unhappy that they had had no say in the adoption of Trajan, and even more unhappy that he was a mere Spanish provincial. But the new emperor's demeanor disarmed even his most pessimistic critics. In both word and deed, Trajan signaled that he was returning to the old Augustan model of the emperor's princeps, merely the first among equals. This went a long way towards assuaging the doubts of the aristocracy, who quickly came to view Trajan as not only a man they could work with, but also a man who would work with them. Indeed, Trajan wound up as a sort of ironic flip side to Domitian. Domitian had sought to emulate all of Augustus's ends, while ignoring the first emperor's means. Trajan, meanwhile, emulated Augustus's means, while, as we will soon see, pursuing his own very different ends. Trajan spent the next 2 years in Rome solidifying his position, always with one eye on Dacia, but otherwise focused on ensuring political and economic peace across the empire he now commanded. To gain the support of the Senate, he freed more of Domitian's old political prisoners and returned more confiscated property to the aristocratic victims of the last Flavian's regime. To gain the support of the people, he announced his intention to continue and extend Nerva's alimentary system, and then ensure that his stepfather would receive proper deification from the Senate for the good work he had done in service to the empire. He then set about systematically reducing the size and scope of the imperial court. Domitian had built an executive branch that commanded and controlled the goings-on of the whole empire. Trajan had no interest in acting as an omniscient central authority, and let it be known that in the future he would rely on the sound judgment of his provincial governors to decide for themselves how to handle their territories. He would issue orders on the most important or dangerous issues. But other than that, requests for instructions were usually returned with a note telling the governor, politely, to figure it out for himself. Trajan's bottom line was that you know the people and specific circumstances of your province best, and I have no intention of micromanaging you from Rome. Of course, Trajan had no intention of micromanaging from Rome because he planned to be busy with other, more important things, like, for example, the conquest of Dacia. The whole time he was busy solidifying his political position, he was simultaneously focused on redeploying the legions to ensure the success of his planned campaign. In addition to raising 2 new legions, he reorganized who was stationed where to ensure that when he marched across the Danube, border security would not suffer because of the troops he had pulled away from their previous posts. He also put his men to work expanding and strengthening the road network south of the Danube to ensure the stability of his supply lines. There's an old maxim that amateurs think about strategy while professionals think about logistics. If this is true, then Trajan was a consummate professional. His wars in Dacia would become legendary not for the battle plans he drew up, but for the engineering feats he employed to make the campaigns possible. Not since Caesar had built his bridges across the Rhine had the ancient world seen military engineering the likes of which Trajan demanded. Leading the emperor's corps of engineers was a key lieutenant who would eventually go to Apollodorus of Damascus. The Greek-born native of Syria, at some point, came to the attention of Trajan, and when the latter became emperor, he brought Apollodorus in as his chief architect, builder, and sculptor. Over the course of his reign, if Trajan needed something built, a bridge, a road, a triumphal arch, a new forum for Rome, another triumphal arch, he always turned to Apollodorus, who fulfilled his emperor's requests with what would eventually become world-famous vision and skill. The stone bridge he would soon build across the Danube would not only be the first permanent bridge across that great river, but also stand as the longest bridge ever built by humans for over 1,000 years. But before he could display his skills, he needed the opportunity to use them, and in 101, Trajan was ready to create the opportunity they both needed to achieve everlasting fame. Satisfied that the empire was in good working order, and the legions were in place to prosecute and support his invasion of Dacia, Trajan went to the Senate and asked for their permission to invade. He didn't need to do this, obviously, but he thought it prudent and beneficial to let the Senate give their seal of approval to his plans. Gratified by the deference they had been shown thus far, and the respect they were being shown now, the Senate overwhelmingly supported Trajan and gave him their firm blessing to go out a-conquering. The emperor traveled to Moesia to take personal command of the 4-legion-strong invasion force, and in March 101, crossing a temporary but still impressive bridge Apollodorus had built across the Danube, he led his legions into Dacia. Fully cognizant of the trap Cornelius Fuscus had blundered into by advancing too quickly, Trajan took his time moving north, fully scouting and securing each territory before moving in. Decebalus had been waiting for years for the Romans to invade, and was eager to test out his new defensive network. If he could repel Trajan, his renown would grow, and he would be able to possibly cobble together a kingdom strong enough to stand against the Romans not just temporarily, but forever. Trajan, though, was an altogether different animal from the mediocre generals Domitian had sent previously, and rather than eternal renown, Decebalus would go down in history as just another barbarian king bested by the might of Rome.